Welcome back to HOA Justice Stories. Let us get into it. She was already at my mailbox when I pulled into the driveway. Ruth Ramirez, HOA president of the Heritage Row HOA, wearing a coral blazer that practically glowed in the afternoon sun, holding a clipboard like a weapon. She did not wait for me to get out of the truck. She marched straight over, her heels clicking on the brick sidewalk, and stabbed a finger at my roof. "You are in violation of the architectural review standards. Your roof shingle color is not approved. I am giving you 48 hours to submit a compliance plan or you will face fines." I stood there with my tool bag still in my hand, staring at her. I am a city utility technician. I fix water mains and storm drains. I moved to Charleston, South Carolina 6 months ago to be closer to family, and I bought a little craftsman bungalow on a quiet street in a charming old neighborhood with strict architectural review and porch rules. The Heritage Row HOA runs this place like a museum. Every paint color, every fence post, every window frame has to go through committee approval. I knew that when I signed the paperwork, but I had not changed a single thing on my roof. I looked up at the shingles. They were the same weathered gray they had been the day I bought the house. I said, "Ruth, I have not touched the roof." She did not blink. "The records show a color change. You need to submit documentation proving compliance or apply for retroactive approval." I felt my jaw tighten. "What records?" She tapped her clipboard. "Take it up with the committee." That was the first time I heard her say it. Take it up with the committee. I would hear it again. I asked when the supposed change happened. She said the inspection was conducted last week. I said I wanted to see the inspection report. She said it would be provided at the hearing. I said I had not received any notice of a hearing. She said it was in the mail. Then she turned and walked back to her car, leaving me standing in my own driveway with a violation notice taped to my front door that I had not even seen yet. I went inside and pulled the notice off the door. It was printed on Heritage Row HOA letterhead. Violation, unauthorized roof shingle color modification. Deadline, submit compliance documentation within 48 hours or face a $500 fine on a mandatory hearing. I sat down at the kitchen table and opened my phone. I scrolled back through my photos. I had taken pictures of the house the day I moved in. I had pictures from the home inspection. I had pictures from every angle because I was proud of the place. I pulled up the roof shots. The shingles were the same gray in every single one. I zoomed in. Same texture, same weathering pattern. I checked the metadata. The timestamps were all from 6 months ago, right after I closed. I took a deep breath and started building a file. The next morning, I called the city code office. I explained the situation. The woman on the phone said HOA rules are private, and the city does not enforce them unless there is a safety violation. I said I understood, but I wanted to confirm that my roof met city code. She said if the shingles were in good condition and the color was not fluorescent or reflective, the city did not care. I said thank you and hung up. That gave me one piece of leverage. The HOA could claim whatever they wanted, but the city had no problem with my roof. I needed more. I needed someone who knew the Heritage Row architectural guidelines inside and out. I needed an ally. I remembered meeting a woman named Claire at a neighborhood coffee morning a few weeks earlier. She was a local preservation volunteer who had lived in Heritage Row for 20 years. She knew the history of every house on the block. She had helped write the original design standards back in the early 2000s. I texted her and asked if she had a few minutes to talk. She called me back within an hour. I explained the violation notice. She was silent for a moment, then she said, "Your house was built in 1924. The roof was replaced in 2003 with architectural shingles in Heritage Gray. That color has been on the approved list since day one. If Ruth is claiming you changed it, she is either confused or lying. I felt a weight lift off my chest. I asked if she would be willing to look at my photos and compare them to the guidelines. She said she would do better than that. She said she would pull the original approval records from the county archives and meet me at my house that afternoon. Claire showed up at 3 with a folder full of photocopied documents. We stood on the sidewalk and she pointed at my roof. She said, "That is heritage gray. I would bet my house on it." She opened the folder and showed me a faded approval form from 2003 with a color swatch stapled to the corner. It matched. She said, "Ruth has been looking for a reason to come after you since you moved in." I asked why. She said, "Because you are new and you do not kiss the ring. She likes control. And she does not like it when people question her." I said, "I have not questioned her about anything." Claire laughed. "You exist. That is enough." I asked Claire what I should do. She said, "First, document everything. Take new photos today with timestamps. Print your old photos with the metadata visible. Get a written statement from me confirming the color has not changed. Then submit all of it to the committee before the 48-hour deadline. Make them respond in writing. If they still claim you are in violation, demand a hearing and bring the receipts." I said I would. She said, "And one more thing, record everything." Ruth has a habit of changing her story when she gets cornered. I thanked her, and she left. I spent the rest of the afternoon taking new photos from every angle. I printed everything and assembled a packet. I included Claire's statement, the county approval record, my move-in photos, and the city code confirmation. I put it all in a large envelope and drove it to Ruth's house before the sun went down. I rang the doorbell. Ruth opened the door and looked at the envelope like it was contaminated. I said, "Here is my compliance documentation." She did not take it. She said, "You were supposed to submit it to the committee office." I said, "You are the committee president. You are the office." She sighed and took the envelope. She said, "This will be reviewed at the next meeting." I said, "When is that?" She said, 2 weeks. I said, "The notice said I had 48 hours or I would be fined." She said, "The fine is automatic if you do not submit." You submitted. Now we review. I said, "So I am not fined?" She said, "That depends on the review." Then she closed the door. 2 days later, I got another notice. This one was not taped to my door. It was hand-delivered by a guy in a Heritage Row HOA polo shirt who knocked and handed it to me like a court summons. Conduct violation. Hostile and aggressive tone toward HOA leadership. Penalty. Mandatory attendance at a special hearing scheduled for the following Tuesday at 7 in the evening. I read it twice. I could not believe it. I had been polite. I had followed the process. I had submitted documentation. And now they were writing me up for my attitude. I texted Claire. She replied immediately, "This is retaliation. They are trying to rattle you. Do not give them the satisfaction. Show up. Be calm. Bring your evidence. And record the whole thing if the bylaws allow it." I checked the bylaws. They did not prohibit recording. I made a note. That weekend I was working on the porch. I was installing a brass house number template I had bought at an antique shop downtown. It was a small thing, but it made the house feel more like mine. I was drilling the pilot holes when I saw Ruth walking up the sidewalk with another woman I did not recognize. I kept working. Ruth stopped at the edge of my yard and called out, "You need committee approval for any exterior modifications." I looked up. I said, "It is a house number template. It is brass. It matches the period." Ruth said, "It is still a modification. You are required to submit a request." I said, "The bylaws say decorative hardware under 6 inches does not require approval." She said, "That is for door hardware." "This is signage." I said, "It is not signage. It is a number template." She said, "Take it up with the committee." There it was again. The same line. The same dismissive tone. I felt my hands tighten on the drill, but I kept my voice level. I said, "I will bring it up at the hearing on Tuesday." She smiled like she had won something and walked away. Monday afternoon, my contractor called. I had scheduled him to repaint the shutters later that week. He said, "I can fit you in tomorrow morning, but if you push it any later, I am booked for a month." I thought about the hearing. I thought about the HOA watching my every move. I said, "Let me call you back." I called Claire. I explained the time pressure. She said, "Do not let them control your schedule. If the shutters need paint and the contractor is available, do it. Just make sure the color is on the approved list." I checked the list. The color I had chosen was right there. I called the contractor back and told him to start in the morning. That night I could not sleep. I kept thinking about the hearing. I kept thinking about Ruth's face when she said, "Take it up with the committee." I kept thinking about the conduct violation and the roof accusation and the brass template. None of it made sense unless Claire was right. Unless this was personal. Unless Ruth was using the rules as a weapon because I had not played along. I sat up in bed and opened my phone. I scrolled through the bylaws again. I found the section on hearings. It said any homeowner accused of a violation had the right to present evidence and call witnesses. It also said the committee was required to provide written findings within 7 days of the hearing. I screenshotted the section and added it to my file. Tuesday morning, the contractor showed up at 8. He started setting up his ladder and dropped cloths. I was inside making coffee when I heard a car door slam. I looked out the window. Ruth was standing in my driveway, talking to the contractor. I went outside. She was holding her clipboard again. She said, "Do you have approval for this work?" I said, "The color is on the approved list. I submitted the request 2 weeks ago." She said, "I do not see it in the system." I said, "I have the confirmation email." She said, "Email is not official. You need to submit a paper form." I pulled out my phone and showed her the email. It was from the HOA committee inbox, dated 2 weeks prior, with a subject line that said "Shutter repaint request received." She barely looked at it. She said, "That is an automated reply. It does not mean approval." I said, "It does not say I need a paper form. It says the request will be reviewed within 10 business days. It has been 14. She said, "Then you should have followed up." I said, "I am following up now." She said, "The work needs to stop until we confirm." I said, "The contractor can only fit me in today. If I stop now, I lose the slot." She said, "That is not my problem. Take it up with the committee." I felt something snap. I said, "You are doing this on purpose." She said, "Excuse me?" I said, "You are inventing obstacles because you do not like me." She stepped closer. She said, "I am enforcing the rules. If you have a problem with that, you can take it up with the committee." I said, "You are the committee." She said, "I am the president. The committee is 5 people. You will meet them tonight." Then she walked back to her car and drove away. The contractor looked at me. He said, "What do you want me to do?" I said, "Keep working. If they find me, they find me. But I am not letting her run my life." By noon, the shutters were half done. I was inside answering work emails when my phone buzzed. It was a group text from a number I did not recognize. The message said, "Did you hear about the guy on Magnolia Street who is destroying the historic character of the neighborhood? Painting his shutters without approval and putting up random hardware. The HOA is going to have to crack down." I stared at the screen. Magnolia Street was my street. I was the guy. I did not recognize the number, but I recognized the tone. Someone was spreading a rumor. I texted Claire. She replied, "That is Ruth's next-door neighbor. She does this every time Ruth wants to build a case. Ignore it. Focus on tonight." I spent the afternoon preparing. I printed every photo. I printed the email confirmation. I printed the bylaws section about hearings. I printed Claire's statement and the county approval record. I put everything in a binder with tabs. I tested my phone's voice recorder app. I made sure the battery was full. I put the phone in my jacket pocket where I could reach it easily. Then I sat down and wrote out what I was going to say. I was not going to let Ruth control the narrative. I was going to present the facts, stay calm, and make them answer for every accusation. And I was going to make sure there was a record. The hearing was held in the community clubhouse at the end of the street. I arrived 10 minutes early. The room was set up like a courtroom. 5 chairs behind a long table at the front. Rows of folding chairs for residents. Ruth was already there, sitting in the center chair shuffling papers. The other 4 committee members were older residents I had seen at neighborhood events but never spoken to. Claire was sitting in the back row. She gave me a small nod. I sat down in the front row and put my binder on my lap. Ruth called the meeting to order at exactly 7. She said, "We are here to address multiple violations by the homeowner at 42 Magnolia Street. Unauthorized roof modification, unauthorized exterior hardware installation, and conduct unbecoming of a Heritage Row resident." I felt my pulse kick up, but I kept my face neutral. Ruth started with the roof. She said, "Our records indicate a color change occurred sometime in the past 6 months. The homeowner has submitted documentation claiming no change occurred, but the documentation is insufficient." I raised my hand. Ruth said, "You will have a chance to speak." I lowered my hand. She continued. She said, "The committee has reviewed photos from the original listing and compared them to recent images. There is a visible difference." I could not stay quiet. I said, "What difference?" She said, "The tone is warmer." I said, "The tone is the same. The lighting is different." She said, "That is your opinion." I said, "I have metadata. I have timestamps. I have a preservation expert who confirmed the color has not changed." Ruth said, "The committee does not recognize outside experts." I said, "She helped write the guidelines." Ruth said, "That does not make her an authority on this case." I felt the frustration rising. I said, "Then what evidence do you have? Show me the inspection report. Show me the photos." Ruth shuffled through her papers. She pulled out a single printed photo and held it up. It was a grainy image of my roof taken from the street. I could barely make out the shingles. I said, "That does not prove anything." She said, "It proves a change occurred." I said, "It proves the lighting was different when you took the picture." She said, "Your tone is hostile." I said, "My tone is frustrated because you are accusing me of something I did not do." She said, "This is exactly the conduct issue we are addressing. You are argumentative. You are dismissive. You are undermining the authority of this committee." I took a breath. I said, "I am defending myself. That is my right under the bylaws." She said, "Your rights do not include disrespect." One of the other committee members, an older man in a cardigan, cleared his throat. He said, "Ruth, do we have any evidence beyond this one photo?" Ruth looked at him like he had betrayed her. She said, "The photo is sufficient." He said, "I am looking at the homeowner's documentation. He has multiple photos with timestamps showing the roof color has been consistent since he purchased the property. He also has a statement from Claire Henderson confirming the color is original." Ruth said, "Claire is not on this committee." The man said, "But she is a credible source." Ruth said, We are not here to debate credibility. We are here to enforce compliance." The man sat back and said nothing else. I could see Ruth's jaw tighten. She moved on to the brass template. She said the homeowner installed exterior hardware without approval. I said the bylaws exempt decorative hardware under 6 inches. She said that exemption applies to door hardware only. I said it does not say that. I pulled out the bylaw page and read it aloud. Decorative hardware under 6 inches in dimension, including but not limited to door handles, kick plates, and house number fixtures, does not require prior approval provided it is consistent with the architectural period of the home. I looked up. I said, "House number fixtures." That is exactly what I installed. Ruth said, "That language is outdated. The current interpretation requires approval." I said, "Show me the current interpretation in writing." She said, "It is not codified. It is committee practice." I said, "Then it is not enforceable." Another committee member, a woman in her 60s, leaned forward. She said, "Ruth, if the bylaw says house number fixtures are exempt, I do not see how we can penalize him." Ruth said, "The intent of the bylaw is to prevent unauthorized changes." The woman said, "But the language is clear." Ruth said, "The language is subject to interpretation." The woman said, "Not when it is this specific." Ruth looked around the table. She was losing control. She said, "Fine, we will table the hardware issue. But the roof violation stands, and the conduct violation is undeniable." I said, "What conduct?" She said, "You accused me of targeting you. You raised your voice. You refused to stop work when I instructed you to." I said, "I did not refuse. I made a business decision based on my contractor's schedule." She said, "You defied a direct order from the HOA president." I said, "You do not have the authority to issue direct orders. You have the authority to enforce rules. And I have the right to continue approved work." Ruth stood up. She said, "This hearing is over. The committee will deliberate and issue findings within 7 days." I said, "I am not finished." She said, "Yes, you are." I said, "I have evidence you have not seen." She said, "Submit it in writing." I said, "I am submitting it now." I opened my binder and pulled out the photo timeline. I laid it on the table. I said, "These are photos of my roof from the day I moved in, sorted by date and time. You can see the metadata. You can see the color is identical in every image." I also have a written statement from a preservation expert and a county approval record showing the current color has been approved since 2003. Ruth barely glanced at it. She said, "The committee will review." I said, "You are not reviewing anything. You made up your mind before I walked in here." She said, "That is an accusation." I said, "It is an observation. You have not provided a single piece of evidence. You have not explained how a roof color can change without work being done. You have not addressed the fact that the city code office confirmed my roof is compliant. You are inventing violations because you do not like me." The room went silent. Ruth's face went red. She said, "You do not get to talk to me like that." I said, "I am talking to the committee. You are part of the committee." She said, "I am the president." I said, "That does not make you immune to questions." She slammed her hand on the table. She said, "You think you can walk in here and challenge everything because you are new? You think the rules do not apply to you?" I said, "I think the rules apply to everyone, including you." She said, "I have been running this HOA for 8 years. I have kept property values stable. I have maintained the character of this neighborhood. And I am not going to let some city worker with an attitude tear it down. I felt the words land. I said, "There it is." She blinked. She said, "What?" I said, "You just admitted this is not about the roof. It is about my attitude." She said, "I did not say that." I said, "You just did. You said you are not going to let someone with an attitude tear down the neighborhood. That means this is personal." Ruth opened her mouth, then closed it. One of the other committee members said, "Ruth, maybe we should take a break." Ruth said, "No. We are finishing this." She looked at me. She said, "You are out of order." I said, "I am on the record." She said, "What record?" I pulled my phone out of my pocket and held it up. I said, "I have been recording since the start of the meeting. The bylaws do not prohibit it. You just admitted on tape that this is about my attitude, not the roof." Ruth's face went white. She said, "You recorded this meeting without consent?" I said, "I recorded a public HOA hearing." Everyone in this room had the opportunity to object when I sat down. No one did. She looked at the other committee members. She said, "Did any of you know about this?" They all shook their heads. The older man said, "Ruth, if he is right about the bylaws, the recording is legal." Ruth said, "I do not care if it is legal. It is unethical." I said, "What is unethical is writing someone up for a violation that does not exist. What is unethical is using conduct rules to punish someone for asking questions. What is unethical is admitting out loud that this is personal and then trying to backtrack." Ruth sat down. She looked at the papers in front of her. She said, "The committee will deliberate." I said, "I am not done. I have one more thing." She said, "What?" I said, "I have a question for the committee. If you vote to uphold the roof violation, I want to know what evidence you are relying on. Because I have submitted a complete photo timeline, a county approval record, and an expert statement. You have submitted one grainy photo and a claim that the tone looks warmer. If you vote against me, I need to know what standard you are applying. Because if the standard is that Ruth does not like me, then we need to say that out loud." The older man cleared his throat again. He said, "I move that we dismiss the roof violation. There is insufficient evidence of any change." The woman in her 60s said, "I second." Ruth said, "You cannot do that without a full vote." The man said, "Then let us vote." Ruth looked around the table. She said, "All in favor of dismissing the roof violation?" 3 hands went up. Ruth did not raise hers. Neither did the 5th member, a younger guy who had not said a word the whole meeting. The man said, "Motion carries. The roof violation is dismissed." Ruth's hands were shaking. She said, "Fine. The conduct violation stands." I said, "On what grounds?" She said, "You were hostile. You were disrespectful. You recorded the meeting without notice." I said, "I was firm. I was direct. And I recorded a public meeting under the rights granted by the bylaws. None of that is a violation." She said, "The committee will decide." The older man said, "Ruth, I think we need to be careful here. If the recording shows that your objections were personal, we could be opening the HOA to a lawsuit." Ruth said, "There is no lawsuit." He said, "But there could be." The woman in her 60s said, "I agree. I think we should dismiss the conduct violation and close this case." Ruth said, "No." The woman said, "Ruth, you just said on tape that this is about his attitude. That is not a basis for enforcement." Ruth said, "I did not say that. I said I have the recording. Do you want me to play it?" There was a long silence. Ruth looked at me. She looked at the committee. She looked at Claire in the back row. Then she stood up and said, "This meeting is adjourned." The older man said, "Ruth, we have not voted on the conduct violation." Ruth said, "I am adjourning the meeting." She picked up her clipboard and walked out of the room. The other committee members looked at each other. The woman in her 60s said, "I move that we dismiss the conduct violation and close this case." The older man said, "I second." They voted. 4 in favor. The younger guy abstained. The case was closed. I walked out of the clubhouse with Claire. She said, "You handled that perfectly." I said, "I thought she was going to kick me out." She said, "She tried. But you had the bylaws on your side. And you had the recording. That was brilliant." I said, "I was not trying to be brilliant. I was trying to protect myself." She said, "Same thing." We walked back to my house. The contractor had finished the shutters. They looked sharp. I stood on the sidewalk and looked up at the brass house number template. It caught the streetlight. Claire said, "It looks good." I said, "Thanks." She said, "You know this is not over, right?" I said, "What do you mean?" She said, "Ruth does not lose gracefully. She will find another way to come at you." I said, "Let her try. I have the receipts." The next morning I got an email from the HOA committee inbox. It was a formal notice that the roof violation and conduct violation had been dismissed due to insufficient evidence. It also included a note that the committee had voted to review the authority of the HOA president to issue unilateral stop work orders. I forwarded the email to my contractor and told him he was clear to finish any future work without interference. He replied with a thumbs-up emoji. I felt a weight lift. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe. But Claire was right. It was not over. 2 days later, I was pulling weeds in the front yard when a car pulled up. It was not Ruth. It was a man in a suit. He got out and walked up to me. He said, "Are you the homeowner?" I said, "Yes." He said, "I am with the Heritage Row Management Company. We have received a complaint that you have been harassing the HOA president." I stood up. I said, "That is not true." He said, "We have a written statement from Ruth Ramirez alleging that you recorded a private meeting without consent and made threatening remarks." I said the meeting was public. The bylaws allow recording, and I did not threaten anyone. He said, "Do you have proof?" I said, "I have the recording." He said, "I would like to hear it." We sat on my porch steps. I pulled out my phone and played the recording. I started from the moment Ruth accused me of undermining the committee. I played her saying that I was argumentative and dismissive. I played her slamming her hand on the table. I played her saying she was not going to let some city worker with an attitude tear down the neighborhood. The man in the suit listened without interrupting. When the recording ended, he said, "This does not sound like harassment. This sounds like a homeowner defending himself." I said, "That is what it was." He said, "Did you threaten her at any point?" I said, "No." He said, "Did you raise your voice?" I said, "I was firm, but I did not yell." He said, "Did you make any physical gestures?" I said, "I held up my phone to show I was recording." "That is it." He nodded. He said, "I am going to recommend that the management company dismiss the complaint." I said, "Thank you." He said, "But I also want to give you some advice. Ruth is not going to let this go. She has been president for a long time, and she does not handle challenges well. If you plan to stay in this neighborhood, you need to be prepared for more of this." I said, "I am not going anywhere." He left. I sat on the porch and looked at the brass house number template. It had become a symbol. It was the thing Ruth had tried to use against me, and it was still there. I was still here. I texted Claire and told her what happened. She replied, "Good. Now we go on a fence." I said, "What do you mean?" She said, "Ruth violated the bylaws when she issued that stop work order. She also violated them when she filed a false harassment complaint. We can petition the board to remove her as president." I said, "Is that realistic?" She said, "If we get enough signatures, yes." I said, "How many do we need?" She said, 20% of homeowners. That is about 15 people. I know at least 10 who are fed up with her. I said, "Let me think about it." She said, "Do not think too long. She is going to come at you again." If you are enjoying this story, hit that like button and subscribe for more HOA drama. That weekend, I walked the neighborhood and talked to people. I introduced myself to neighbors I had only waved to before. I asked them about their experiences with the HOA. Almost everyone had a story. One guy said Ruth had fined him $300 for parking his truck in his own driveway overnight. Another woman said Ruth had rejected her fence proposal 4 times over the shade of white. An older couple said Ruth had threatened to put a lien on their house because their mailbox post was 2 inches too tall. I listened. I took notes. I did not ask anyone to sign anything yet. I just wanted to know if I was alone. I was not. On Monday, I got another email. This one was from Ruth directly. It said, "I am writing to inform you that the Heritage Row HOA Board has voted to conduct a special assessment of all properties on Magnolia Street to ensure compliance with current architectural standards. Your property will be inspected on Friday at 10 in the morning. Please ensure that all exterior areas are accessible." I read it twice. I forwarded it to Claire. She called me immediately. She said, "This is retaliation. There is no such thing as a street-wide special assessment unless there is a safety issue." I said, "What do I do?" She said, "Show up. Let them inspect. Document everything. And if they try to write you up for anything frivolous, we file a formal complaint with the management company." I said, "Okay." She said, "And start getting those signatures. We need to move fast." I printed out a petition. It was 1 page. It said, "We, the undersigned homeowners of Heritage Row, petition the board to remove Ruth Ramirez as HOA president due to repeated violations of the bylaws, abuse of authority, and retaliation against homeowners who exercise their rights." I walked it around the neighborhood that night. I got 5 signatures in 2 hours. By Wednesday, I had 12. By Thursday, I had 16. On Friday morning, I had 19. I needed 1 more. The inspection was scheduled for 10. Ruth showed up at 9:30 with 2 other people I did not recognize. One was a man with a clipboard. The other was a woman with a camera. I was standing on the porch when they walked up. Ruth did not greet me. She said, "We are conducting the inspection. Please step aside." I said, "I would like to know what you are inspecting for." She said, "General compliance." I said, "With what standards?" She said, "The architectural guidelines." I said, "I have read the guidelines. My property is compliant." She said, "That is what we are here to determine." I said, "Fine. Go ahead." I pulled out my phone and started recording. Ruth said, "You do not have permission to record this." I said, "This is my property. I have every right to record what happens on it." She looked at the man with the clipboard. She said, "Make a note. Homeowner is uncooperative." They walked around the property. They took pictures of the shutters. They took pictures of the roof. They took pictures of the brass template. They took pictures of the mailbox, the porch railing, the front steps, and the flower beds. The man with the clipboard wrote constantly. I followed them the whole time, recording. After 20 minutes, they finished. Ruth walked back to the porch. She said, "We will issue our findings within 7 days." I said, "What findings? You have not told me what you are looking for." She said, "Any deviations from the guidelines." I said, "Such as?" She said, "That will be in the report." I said, "I want to see the guidelines you are using." She said, "They are available on the HOA website." I said, "I have read the website. I want to see the version you are using today." She said, "It is the same version." I said, "Then there should not be any problem showing it to me." She said, "Take it up with the committee." She turned and walked away. I called Claire as soon as they left. She said, "That was a fishing expedition. They are looking for anything they can use." I said, "They will not find anything." She said, "They will invent something." I said, "Then I will fight it." She said, "Good. How many signatures do you have?" I said, 19. She said, "I will get you the 20th. Give me 2 hours." She called me back 90 minutes later. She said, "I got it. A guy on Oak Street. He has been waiting for someone to stand up to Ruth for years." I said, "That is 20. She said, "I know. I am bringing the petition to the management company tomorrow." I said, "What happens next?" She said, "They have to call a special board meeting within 14 days. At that meeting, the board votes on whether to remove Ruth. If a majority votes yes, she is out." I said, "What are the odds?" She said, "Better than you think. 2 of the board members voted to dismiss your violations. They are already on our side. We just need 1 more." The next week was quiet. I did not hear from Ruth. I did not get any violation notices. I went to work, came home, and waited. On Wednesday, the management company sent an email to all Heritage Row homeowners. It said, "A special board meeting has been scheduled for Saturday, March 15th at 2 in the afternoon at the community clubhouse. The agenda includes a petition to remove the current HOA president. All homeowners are invited to attend." I forwarded the email to Claire. She replied, "Game on." Saturday came. I got to the clubhouse at 1:45. The parking lot was already full. I walked inside. The room was packed. Every folding chair was taken. People were standing along the walls. I saw Claire near the front. She waved me over. I squeezed into a spot next to her. She said, "Ruth is here. She is sitting in the front row with her lawyer." I looked. Ruth was wearing the coral blazer again. She was sitting with a man in a gray suit whispering to him. The board members were already seated at the table. The older man who had voted to dismiss my violations was in the center chair. He called the meeting to order at 2. He said, "We are here to address a petition signed by 20 homeowners requesting the removal of Ruth Ramirez as HOA president. The petition alleges violations of the bylaws, abuse of authority, and retaliation. Miss Ramirez has been given the opportunity to respond." "Ruth, you have the floor." Ruth stood up. She said, "This petition is a coordinated attack by a small group of disgruntled homeowners who do not want to follow the rules. The allegations are false. I have served this community for 8 years. I have maintained property values. I have preserved the character of this neighborhood. And I have done it all while dealing with people who think the rules do not apply to them." She looked directly at me. She said, "One homeowner in particular has made it his mission to undermine this HOA. He has recorded meetings without consent. He has accused me of personal bias. He has filed false complaints. And now he has organized this petition to remove me because I held him accountable. This is not about the bylaws. This is about one man who does not like being told no." The older man said, "Thank you, Ruth. Now we will hear from the petitioners." Claire stood up. She said, "I am one of the 20 signers. I have lived in Heritage Row for 20 years. I helped write the original architectural guidelines. And I am here to tell you that Ruth Ramirez has violated those guidelines repeatedly. She has issued stop work orders without authority. She has written up homeowners for violations that do not exist. She has used conduct rules to punish people for asking questions. And she has retaliated against anyone who challenges her. This is not about one man. This is about a pattern of abuse that has gone on for years. She sat down. The older man said, "Does anyone else wish to speak?" I stood up. I said, "I am the homeowner Ruth just referred to. I moved to this neighborhood 6 months ago. I have followed every rule. I have submitted every request. I have attended every meeting. And I have been written up for violations that were later dismissed because there was no evidence." Ruth accused me of changing my roof color. I provided a complete photo timeline proving no change occurred. She accused me of installing hardware without approval. I provided the bylaw text showing the hardware was exempt. She accused me of having a hostile attitude. I provided a recording of the hearing where she admitted on tape that this was about my attitude, not the rules. I am not here because I do not like being told no. I am here because Ruth uses the rules as a weapon, and if we do not stop her, she will keep doing it to other people. The room was silent. The older man said, "Thank you. Ruth, do you have a response?" Ruth stood up. She said, "The recording was obtained without consent. It is inadmissible." I said, "The bylaws do not prohibit recording public meetings." Ruth said it was not a public meeting, it was a committee hearing. I said, "A committee hearing is a public meeting under the bylaws." Ruth said, "That is your interpretation." I said, "That is the bylaw. Would you like me to read it?" Ruth said, "I do not need you to read anything to me." The older man said, "Ruth, please sit down. Let us move to the vote." Ruth said, "There should not be a vote. This petition is illegitimate." The older man said, "The petition meets the requirements under the bylaws. We are voting." Ruth sat down. The older man said, "The question before the board is whether to remove Ruth Ramirez as HOA president based on the allegations in the petition. Board members, how do you vote?" He started on the left. The woman in her 60s said, "I vote yes." The next member, a man I did not recognize, said, "I vote yes." The younger guy who had abstained before said, "I vote no." The fourth member, another woman, said, "I vote yes." The older man said, "I vote yes." The motion carries 4-1. Ruth Ramirez is removed as HOA president effective immediately. Ruth stood up. She said, "This is illegal. I am calling my lawyer." The older man said, "You are welcome to do that, but the vote stands." Ruth grabbed her purse and walked out of the room. The lawyer followed her. The room erupted in applause. Claire hugged me. She said, "You did it." I said, "We did it." She said, "No. You started it. You stood up when no one else would." I said, "I just wanted to keep my house." She said, "You did more than that. You changed this place." The older man walked over. He said, "The board will be appointing an interim president next week. We will also be reviewing the architectural guidelines to make sure they are clear and enforceable. If you have any suggestions, we would love to hear them." I said, "Just make sure the rules are applied fairly." He said, "That is the goal." I walked home that afternoon and stood on my porch. The brass house number template gleamed in the sunlight. The shutters were freshly painted. The roof was the same gray it had always been. Everything looked exactly the way it should. I pulled out my phone and took a picture. I sent it to Claire with a message, "Receipts delivered." She replied with a laughing emoji and the words, "Property values preserved." The following Monday, I got a letter in the mail. It was from the Heritage Row HOA board. It said, On behalf of the Board of Directors, we apologize for the conduct of the former president and the violations that were improperly issued against your property. All records of those violations have been removed from your file. We appreciate your patience and your commitment to the community. I folded the letter and put it in the binder with all my other documents. Then I walked outside and sat on the porch. The neighborhood was quiet. The brick sidewalks were clean. The old oak trees rustled in the breeze. It felt like home. Thanks for watching, and I will catch you in the next one.